We're still awaiting results from two key states that could outline Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden's path to victory. In Arizona, Biden's lead has narrowed slightly in recent days. The former Veep is within the margin of error. Over to Nevada, Biden holds a slim lead over the president, with his margin more than doubling since Wednesday. So for more on this, let us bring in CBS News campaign reporter Alex Tin. Alex, so how many ballots remain to be counted in Arizona, and when do officials expect to be able to announce the results there?
Well, it's a bit of a moving target, but our best estimate, based on figures we've gotten from the Arizona Secretary of State, is that there's around 300,000 ballots left to be counted here in the state of Arizona. That's as of the latest figures we have from the state last night. Most of those ballots are right here in Maricopa County, the state's most populous. 6 in 10 of the state's registered voters live right here in this state, and we're expecting a new drop of results from them 9 a.m. this morning. That's, if you're on the East Coast, 10, 11 o'clock your time. So we'll probably learn a little bit more about the election then, but it's not going to be all of the results. It's probably going to take at least until this weekend to get through the majority of those remaining ballots.
So what about Nevada? Among the ballots left to be processed in Nevada, there are 63,000 that remain outstanding in just Clark County. So what can you tell us about this region and this county? What should we know about what we might expect from the results?
Well, Clark County, as that state's most populous county, has always been a key target for Democrats, trying to drive turnout in their key hospitality-driven base that mans the casinos and the Las Vegas Strip that you imagine when you think of Las Vegas. That working-class, majority-minority base of voters has been a key focus in the middle of this pandemic for the Democratic Party, as they were concerned that many of these voters would either have left the state or would have gone somewhere else or just wouldn't have the time to cast their ballots. We'll see now whether their efforts have paid off as we get this last, remaining set of ballots over the coming days in Clark County.
So, Alex, Republicans have filed a lawsuit alleging voter fraud in the state. What are they claiming happened, and how are state officials responding, particularly the Republican governor of the state and the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia?
So in Nevada, just to be clear, the Trump campaign is not officially a named plaintiff in this suit in Nevada.
Oh, Nevada.
However,
Sorry, Alex. Yes.
The Trump
Nevada.
campaign was yeah, exactly. That's okay. But the Trump campaign was indeed the first ones to announce that they were planning on, announcing this lawsuit alleging voter fraud. The state's campaign co-chair tweeted when the news of this lawsuit was filed, "We just filed a lawsuit." And when you look into the lawsuit, you'll see that the two named plaintiffs, one of them says in the declaration, "I was planning on voting for Donald Trump and I think I was disenfranchised." And the other one says, "I was working as a ballot observer for Donald Trump and they kicked me out of the polling center." Now, again, to be clear, there is no evidence as of this moment of voter fraud in the state of Nevada. However, what they are alleging here is slightly different. They're pointing to all these examples of what they say are irregularities in the vote tally so far in Nevada. And they point to some specific details about how they're processing signatures in Clark County, which we just talked about, and verifying whether mail ballots were indeed cast by that person. What they are asking for is not to stop counting mail ballots as in some other states. They're just saying we want to change the process. We want to remove this system that you have that is allowing you to process mail ballots so quickly. To be clear, the effect of what they're asking would dramatically slow counting in Clark County and probably dramatically slow any future results coming from Nevada.
What about Arizona? We know that one of the more colorful conspiracy theories about this election has come out of Arizona, Sharpie Gate. That has been very clearly debunked. Is the Trump campaign considering legal action in Arizona?
Well, to be clear, in Arizona as well, the Trump campaign has already been granted a motion to intervene in a state case over this Sharpiegate conspiracy theory, as has the local Democratic Party here in the state of Arizona. Now, again, they are not exactly alleging that they completely agree with all of these concerns. And in fact, even the Republican Attorney General of this state, Mark Brnovich, who initially said, I'm looking into this, I've heard the voter complaints about the potential issues of Sharpies invalidating voters' ballots, just said last night in a letter that indeed he had concluded that the use of Sharpies in Maricopa County was not linked to any voters being disenfranchised here in this state.
So,
no, in fact, they said they use the Sharpies because they don't smudge. So it was more about actually being particularly accurate and not the other way around.
Right. Right. They were not only allowed, they were encouraged, is the line we've heard from state and local officials.
But Alex, how does that become some kind of a conspiracy theory? I struggle to understand why that would become any type of gate.
Well, it's an interesting question. There is no, but there is a local paper, the Arizona Mirror, that did a really good job kind of deconstructing how they think this conspiracy theory first came to be. Really, it started with a fringe right-wing group here that had posted a video of somebody who said, hey, I think my ballot was invalidated, and I was really concerned because when I used a Sharpie to fill out my ballot, which is a new thing here in Maricopa County for a lot of voters, I noticed that the Sharpie ink was bleeding through the ballot. That spiraled and snowballed into all these people who were looking up their ballots online, saw that it said canceled because they had voted in person. The Secretary of State later clarified when it says canceled on that website, it doesn't mean your vote was canceled. It means you canceled the fact you're voting by mail when you elected to vote in person. But a combination of that confusion, conspiracy theories, and probably some people too who were just genuinely confused, all created this snowball effect where you had many, many people saying, I'm really confused about this. I think I was disenfranchised. But again, to be clear, state, local officials from both parties say this is bogus.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. CBS News estimates that both states will likely go to Biden. What would winning Arizona and Nevada mean for his campaign?
Well, there are two kinds of ways you can look at that question. The first one is obviously the electoral map. Either of these states could play a pivotal role in putting him over the top and making him that presumptive winner. But there's also a historical importance to winning each of these states. In Arizona, I mean, it's a reliably red state. It's a state that hasn't voted for a Democrat for the White House since 1996. That was Bill Clinton. That has traditionally Republican government, that has Republican statewide elected officials, including the Attorney General and the governor. So there is that historical significance in Arizona. In Nevada, there's the significance that, like I said earlier, this was a true test for the Democratic turnout machine in a state that has historically trended blue. Between the pandemic, crippling unemployment, the dramatic impacts of COVID-19 and the year of 2020 on Nevada cannot be overstated. And so this was really that culmination of so many efforts by Democrats to shore up their support in these final few days because they saw that there was a real possibility Nevada could be flipped.
Although, Alex, I got to say, it was really sort of humorous to me to see the state, which, as part of its tourism campaign, suggests that they never sleep in Nevada because of Vegas were the ones that took a little break to count while over in Pennsylvania, and in Georgia, they're like, we're plowing through the night, Right.
Right. Well, and hey, in their defense, they do run multiple shifts. They have been aggressively counting ballots. They had 14 days ahead of the election to count a lion's shares of their ballots. As one strategist in Nevada joked to me, hey, it's not us that are delayed in counting ballots. We're counting this, unprecedented all-mail election at record speed. It's you guys and your decision desk that has decided to say, hey, we think the results are still tight here, so we're going to wait. So again, in Nevada's defense, they're counting at record speed, and it's an unprecedented all-mail election for them.
Yeah, no, I understand. And the other thing that I would love for you to talk about, Alex, before we let you go, is is Arizona, because President Trump won that state back in 2016, and there are some that have already awarded those electoral votes in terms of projections to Vice President Biden. There are some, like CBS News, that have not yet called or projected a winner there in that state. But can you talk about about the demographics? I know you've been in Arizona for quite some time following what is developing there. And what have you seen in terms of demographics and in terms of how people view what goes on in Washington that has changed over the last 4 years?
Well, when you ask the question of, a potential Biden win in the state, again, we haven't projected it, but let's assume that there is a Biden win in the state. Let's assume that Mark Kelly, the Senate candidate on the Democratic side, defeats Republican incumbent Martha McSally here. There are really 2 or 3 trends that a lot of people here will point to as major shifts in the state that probably contributed to the wins. The first one is obviously, the rising power of the Latino vote here in the state, coming out of this whole history of, controversial immigration laws like SB 1070, the infamous, Sheriff Joe Arpaio right here in Maricopa County, all the way to this whole new roster of Democratic leaders on a state and federal level that have really played a significant effort in boosting Latino turnout here in the state. I mean, exit polls right now show a record percentage of Latino vote share as a share of the total votes that were cast in this election. But the other story is crossover voters. I mean, Arizona has a long history of split ticket voting. In 2018, the Democratic Senate candidate here, Kyrsten Sinema, won on the same ballot where many voters here voted for a Republican statewide gubernatorial candidate, Governor Doug Ducey, for his reelection. And you had this huge number of Republicans like Cindy McCain, the widow of the late Senator John McCain, all the way to former Senator Jeff Flake, all of them coming out and saying, hey, I'm still a Republican, I still consider myself to be a conservative, but I'm supporting Joe Biden, and here's why. And it's that shift that is in some ways historic, but also potentially unique to this specific contest.
Hey, well, I got one more question for you, Alex, before you go.
Sure,
Nevada,
go for it.
Another one of these court, these legal challenges here about 3,600 names that the Republican Party is alleging these are people who moved out of state and should not have been able to vote. So they filed a complaint. Do you know anything about that, or criminal referral rather to the U.S. Attorney General William Barr? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, so they sent this letter yesterday to the state's attorney general, and they used what's called the change of address database that's maintained by the Postal Service. When you move from one address to another, you can tell the Postal Service, hey, I moved, send my mail that is going to this old address to this new address. So they took that database, they cross-referenced it with the voter file, it has all these records of people who have cast ballots, and they said, look, there are all of these people out of state who cast ballots, we think so, fraudulently, and they sent that list to the attorney general. Now, there's a few caveats to this list that they sent. Number one, again, it is not against the law to vote while you're out of state. That's, in fact, absentee balloting. Number two, the state's attorney general, a Democrat, told us on CBS this morning, just this morning, that, in fact, he was never even CC'd on this list that they sent to Attorney General Barr. And number three, and this is something that I think is a little bit interesting and something we saw manifest in that lawsuit I mentioned earlier, it sounds like their argument is not exactly that these people moved out of state and cast their ballots while out of state. It sounds like their argument is that these people moved out of state, they didn't get their mail ballot because they had moved somewhere else, and mail ballots aren't forwarded through change of address notifications. But somebody else took that ballot after they had moved out of state, fraudulently signed the ballot, cast the ballot, and then it made it through this signature verification process that they're casting doubt over. Again, there's no actual evidence this happened, and it's certainly possible that a lot of these people legitimately cast their ballots. But that is the argument here, and that's something that we've started to connect the dots on, and hopefully we'll hear more about at this federal court hearing they're asking for today.
Alex, you're doing such an excellent job of breaking down these two states for us. I think Anne-Marie and I keep coming up with new questions to ask you. So let me take this opportunity to ask you another question, which is,
okay.
You are in Phoenix, but you perhaps saw that surreal moment yesterday where you had the former acting director of national intelligence, Richard Grinnell, the chairman of CPAC,
Sure.
Matt Schlapp, in Nevada, essentially, making all sorts of wild and baseless accusations in front of the cameras there, refusing to identify themselves, and then sort of running away and jumping into a black van and driving off to, who knows where. But they had two individuals that they had speak to reporters there. One, an older woman who says that when she went to vote, it turned out that she had already voted, according to her claims. And another gentleman who I wasn't sure exactly what his role was, but he seemed to be a member of the media, who was talking about perhaps trying to observe what the poll and what the ballot counters were doing. Do we have any? It's still stuck. It stuck with me because it was just such a weird moment where they were essentially, having a press conference, but you weren't allowed to ask questions. They wouldn't identify themselves, and then they brought these two people up who had these sort of weird stories, and then they just disappeared. So, what was the deal with that? Specifically, those two individuals, if you know what their story was and what we could verify from what they claimed.
Sure. Yeah, it was an interesting moment. I was joking with somebody earlier that it is such a local news thing where, for them, it makes their jobs a lot easier when you're interviewing somebody and you say, can you just tell me your first and last name so I have it on the tape, and when my editor is sitting in the control room, they don't have to be figuring out who is this video of. So that was a little interesting. I'm not really sure what was behind them refusing to identify themselves when they were even wearing jackets with their names on it. But, okay, whatever. It's interesting because those two people are the named plaintiffs in the case that we saw yesterday and that will potentially go for a federal court hearing today. The first one, like you mentioned, is Jill Stokey. She was actually interviewed by our local affiliate, KLAS, in Las Vegas. She alleges that she went to cast her ballot in person. When she went to cast her ballot in person, they told her, your ballot has been cast already by mail. And they offered her an opportunity to sign an affidavit basically saying, hey, I didn't cast this ballot by mail. Give me another ballot so that I can cast the ballot. She refused to do so and thus was, not allowed to cast the ballot. There is some controversy over whether that's true from the Republican side. On the Democratic side, I'm sorry, there is some controversy over whether that's true, but officials from both parties concur that this was probably not voter fraud. A team from the Republican Secretary of State of Nevada, Barbara Sagaski, went and interviewed her. They investigated the situation, and they concluded that they didn't think any voter fraud had occurred. The Clark County Registrar of Voters, Joe Gloria, at a press conference yesterday was asked about this case, and he said, hey, look, number one, we do indeed believe that she signed that ballot. We think that ballot signature was accurate. And number two, we offered her an opportunity to sign an affidavit saying that, and she refused to do so. Now she says in her court filing that not only was she disenfranchised, but that county officials pressured her into lying on an affidavit. We don't have any evidence for that claim. We'll see what comes out in court. But again, she did sign a declaration under the penalty of perjury saying that this was the case. So we'll see how that turns out. The other person who's a named plaintiff in this case, he is a Fox News commentator. He is also, like I said earlier, a paid ballot counting observer, or I'm sorry, I don't know if he's paid, but he's a ballot counting observer for the Trump campaign in Nevada for the last 2 weeks. And he says that shortly after midnight, Clark County ejected him because he was attempting to film record it. When he was told, hey, ballot counting observers aren't allowed to film record it, he said, well, I'm a member of the media. And when he showed them the credentials, Clark County apparently declined the credentials, at least according to his account. Again, we don't have any evidence for that either. Clark County has offered some details at their press conference yesterday that appears to dispute that. But we'll see more about what happens today at the press conference we're expecting this morning in Clark County, as well as at the hearing.
Boy, oh boy, you gave us a comprehensive overview. All issues very serious and light. We really appreciate that's not even have Alex back in the next hour.
That's right.
Though we know you have a lot of work to do, so we really appreciate you taking the time out, Alex. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you.